In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, or The End of the Social, an essay by Jean Baudrillard, read by Steadyy ΔΕlτα. Translator's note: throughout the text, lamas, thermas imply a condensation of terms, which allows Baudrillard to make a number of central puns and allusions. For not only does lamas directly refer to the physical and philosophical sense of substance or matter, it can just as easily mean the majority, as in the mass of workers, or even the electrical usage of an earth. Hence, thermas can simultaneously mean to form a mass, to form an earth, or to form a majority. Part 4. The Silent Majority. The dwindling of the political from a pure strategic arrangement to a system of representation, then to the present scenario of neofiguration, where the system continues under the same manifold signs, but where these no longer represent anything and no longer have their equivalent in a reality or a real social substance. There is no longer any political investiture, because there is no longer even any social referent of the classical kind, a people, a class, a proletariat, objective conditions, to lend force to effective political signs. Quite simply, there is no longer any social signified to give force to a political signifier. The only referent which still functions is that of the silent majority. All contemporary systems function on this nebulous entity, on this floating substance whose existence is no longer social but statistical, and whose only mode of appearance is that of the survey, a simulation on the horizon of the social, or rather, on whose horizon the social has already disappeared. That the silent majority, or the masses, is an imaginary referent does not mean they don't exist. It means that their representation is no longer possible. The masses are no longer a referent because they no longer belong to the order of representation. They don't express themselves, they are surveyed. They don't reflect upon themselves, they are tested. The referendum, and the media are a constant referendum of directed questions and answers, has been substituted for the political referent. Now polls, tests, the referendum, media are devices which no longer belong to a dimension of representations, but to one of simulation. They no longer have a referent in view, but a model. Here, revolution in relation to the devices of classical sociality, of which elections, institutions, the instances of representation, and even of repression still form a part, is complete. In all this, social meaning still flows between one pole and another, in a dialectical structure which allows for a political stake and contradictions. Everything changes with the device of simulation. In the couple silent majority survey, for example, there is no longer any pole, nor any differential term, hence no electricity of the social either. It is short-circuited by the confusing of poles, in a total circularity of signaling, exactly as is the case with molecular communication and with the substance it informs in DNA and the genetic code. This is the ideal form of simulation. Collapse of poles, orbital circulation of models. This is also the matrix of everywhere implosive process. Bombarded with stimuli, messages, and tests, the masses are simply an opaque, blind stratum, like those clusters of stellar gas known only through analysis of their light spectrum, radiation spectrum equivalent to statistics and surveys. But precisely, it can no longer be a question of expression or representation, but only of the simulation of an ever inexpressible and unexpressed social. This is the meaning of their silence. But this silence is paradoxical. It isn't a silence which does not speak. It is a silence which refuses to be spoken for in its name. And in this sense, far from being a form of alienation, it is an absolute weapon. No one can be said to represent the silent majority, and that is its revenge. The masses are no longer an authority to which one might refer as one formerly referred to a class or to the people. Withdrawn into their silence, they are no longer a subject, especially not to or of history. Hence they can no longer be spoken for, articulated, represented, nor pass through the political mirror stage and the cycle of imaginary identifications. One sees what strength results from this. No longer being a subject, they can no longer be alienated, neither in their own language, they have none, nor in any other which would pretend to speak for them. The end of revolutionary convictions, for these have always speculated on the possibility of the masses, or the proletariat, denying themselves as such. But the mass is not a place of negativity or explosion. It is a place of absorption and implosion. Inaccessible to schemas of liberation, revolution, and historicity. This is its mode of defense, its particular mode of retaliation. Model of simulation and imaginary referent for use by a phantom political class, which now no longer knows what kind of power it wields over it. The mass is at the same time the death, the end of this political process thought to rule over it, and into it is engulfed the political as will and representation. The strategy of power has long seemed founded on the apathy of the masses. The more passive they were, the more secure it was. But this logic is only characteristic of the bureaucratic and centralist phase of power, and it is this which today turns against it. The inertia it has fostered becomes the sign of its own death. That is why it seeks to reverse its strategies from passivity to participation, from silence to speech. But it is too late. The threshold of the critical mass, that of the involution of the social through inertia, is exceeded. Everywhere, the masses are encouraged to speak. They are urged to live socially, electorally, organizationally, sexually, in participation, in festival, in free speech, etc. The specter must be exorcised. It must pronounce its name. Nothing shows more dramatically than the only genuine problem today is the silence of the mass, the silence of the silent majority. All reserves are exhausted in maintaining this mass in controlled emulsion and in preventing it from falling back into its panic-inducing inertia and its silence. No longer being under the reign of will or representation, it falls under the province of diagnosis or divination pure and simple, whence the universal reign of information and statistics. We must osculate it, sound it out, unearth some oracle from within it. Whence the mania for seduction, solicitude, and all the solicitations surrounding it. Whence prediction by resonance, the effects of forecasting, and of an illusory mass outlook. The French people think, the majority of Germans disapprove, all England thrilled to the birth of the prince, etc. A mirror held out for an ever blind, ever absent recognition. Whence that bombardment of signs which the mass is thought to re-echo? It is interrogated by converging waves, by light or linguistic stimuli, exactly like distant stars or nuclei bombarded with particles in a cyclotron. Information is exactly this, not a mode of communication or of meaning, but a mode of constant emulsion, of input-output, and of controlled chain reactions, exactly as in atomic simulation chambers. We must free the energy of the mass in order to fabricate the social. But it is a contradictory process, for information and security in all their forms, instead of intensifying or creating the social relation, are on the contrary, entropic processes, modalities of the end of the social. It is thought that the masses may be structured by injecting them with information. Their captive social energy is believed to be released by the means of information and messages. Today, it is no longer the institutional grid as such. Rather, it is the quantity of information and the degree of media exposure which measures socialization. Quite the contrary. Instead of transforming the mass into energy, information produces even more mass. Instead of informing as it claims, instead of giving form and structure, information neutralizes even further the social field. More and more, it creates an inert mass impermeable to the classical institutions of the social and to the very contents of information. Today, replacing the fission of symbolic structures by the social and its rational violence is the fission of the social itself by the irrational violence of media and information, the final result being precisely an atomized, nuclearized, molecularized mass, the result of the 2 centuries of accelerated socialization, and which brings it irremediably to an end. The mass is only mass because its social energy has already frozen. It is a cold reservoir capable of absorbing and neutralizing any hot energy. It resembles those half-dead systems into which more energy is injected than is withdrawn. Those paid-out deposits exorbitantly maintained in a state of artificial exploitation. Immense energy is expended in mitigating the tendentially declining rate of political investment and the absolute fragility of the social principle of reality, in maintaining this simulation of the social and in preventing it from totally imploding, and the system risks being swallowed up by it. Basically, what goes for commodities also goes for meaning. For a long time, capital only had to produce goods. Consumption ran by itself. Today, it is necessary to produce consumers, to produce demand, and this production is infinitely more costly than that of goods. For the most part, and above all since 1929, the social arose out of this crisis of demand. The production of demand largely overlaps the production of the social itself. For a long time, it was enough for power to produce meaning, political, ideological, cultural, sexual, and the demand followed it. It absorbed supply and still surpassed it. Meaning was in short supply, and all the revolutionaries offered themselves to produce still more. Today, everything has changed. No longer is meaning in short supply, it is produced everywhere, in ever-increasing quantities. It is demand which is weakening, and it is the production of this demand for meaning which has become crucial for the system. Without this demand for, without this susceptibility to, without this minimal participation in meaning, power is nothing but an empty simulacrum and an isolated effect of perspective. Here, too, the production of demand is infinitely more costly than the production of meaning itself. Beyond a certain point, it is impossible. All the energy mustered by the system will no longer be enough. The demand for objects and for services can always be artificially produced at a high but accessible cost. The system has proved this. The desire for meaning, when it is in short supply, and the desire for reality, when it is weakening everywhere, cannot be made good and together threaten total ruin. The mass absorbs all the social energy, but no longer refracts it. It absorbs every sign and every meaning, but no longer reflects them. It absorbs all messages and digests them. For every question put to it, it sends back a tautological and circular response. It never participates. Inundated by flows and tests, it forms a mass on earth. It is happy to be a good conductor of flows, but of any flow, a good conductor of information, but of any information, a good conductor of norms, but of any norm, and thereby to reflect the social in its absolute transparency, to give place only to the effects of power and of the social, the latter like constellations fluctuating around this imperceptible nucleus. The mass is dumb like beasts, and its silence is equal to the silence of beasts. Despite having been surveyed to death, and the constant solicitation, the information to which it is submitted is equivalent to experimental torture on laboratory animals. It says neither whether the truth is to the left or to the right, nor whether it prefers revolution or repression. It is without truth and without reason. It has been attributed with every arbitrary remark. It is without conscience and without unconscience. The silence is unbearable. It is the unknown of the political equation, the unknown which annuls every political equation. Everybody questions it, but never as silence, always to make it speak. But the inertial strength of the masses is unfathomable. Literally, no sounding or survey will cause it to become evident, since their effect is to blanket it out. A silence which topples the political and the social into the hyperreality with which we associate it. For if the political seeks to pick up the masses in a social echo or simulation chamber, the media, information, it is the masses who in return become a huge echo or simulation chamber of the social. Manipulation has never existed. The game is played on both sides, with the same weapons. And who can say which is winning today? The simulation power performs on the masses, or the inverse simulation held out by the masses for power to be swallowed up in?